All right, everybody, so that's a crime lab analyst taking the stand in the George Burch case out of Wisconsin. As she goes into a background a little bit about the examination of a vehicle in this case, I want to get into the nitty-gritty of what we might be watching here. So I'm very happy to join with us on set attorney David Eisbrouch. David, good to see you.
Jesse, good to see you. Nice to be back.
Nice to have you here. Let's talk about we're talking about the car here. The theory put forward by the defense is that George Burch was fooling around with Nicole Vanderheiden outside of her house when this murder occurred, meaning when Douglas Dietrich committed this murder, knocked George out and murdered her. Something about the geography of this and the car outside the house doesn't settle well with me. Does it settle well with you?
Well, the forensics of the car is going to be critical to the defense, obviously. They already found the defendant's DNA on the victim. He's admitting that they had sex, or he's putting forth the story that they had sex. So the DNA being on the victim is not going to become a surprise, and actually the defense is going to use that in their favor. Now, if they were having sex, they're going to look for any other fabrics that were on him that night that may have been in the car. So the testimony of this person is most likely heading in that direction to show whether there were any fabrics, any other evidence of the defendant being in the vehicle that night. So it should be some critical testimony here.
As we watch this testimony, just one final thing. The idea of that the cord and blood was found outside of the home of Nicole and Doug, the idea that this happened right outside the home, not in a secluded location. We know her body was moved to the field. Again, what does that tell you about who might have done this?
Well, it's somewhat of a hurdle, for the defendant in one respect, but on the other hand, they're pointing the finger at the boyfriend who's very familiar with the surroundings, and it was his house. They cohabitated there together. So it almost falls into their favor that it could have been there as opposed to someplace else where she could have been dragged to at the scene of the murder. The fact that it's closer to the house, in my opinion, I think it helps the defense.
And let's not forget that the boyfriend here, Douglas Dietrich, was questioned about the field where her body was eventually found, and he knew about it. But he also knew about other locations in the area as well. I want to go right now back into the courtroom. Let's listen into this crime lab analyst, and we'll be back here to talk more about the case.
I can look at my report. Sure. There were 279 photos taken.
Are all the photographs taken before you actually do any further work? Is that the first thing that happens?
The exterior is photographed, and then the exterior is processed for what I need to process. So, for instance, in this case, swabbing door handles. Then the doors are opened, and the interior photos are taken before any type of testing or further examinations are done.
So once the photographs are done, with respect to this specific vehicle, what did you do?
We examined the interior of the vehicle for any visible stains.
Did you also do the exterior observations and examination that you mentioned?
Yes.
Okay. With respect to the exterior, did you note anything of significance or that might have evidentiary value?
I did notice one possible stain on the exterior door handle, which was tested with phenolphthalein, and it was negative, so it was not collected.
Negative as to what?
For the presence of indication of the presence of blood.
And that was the outside door handle?
Correct.
And you said all the door handles were checked, is that correct?
Yes.
What did you then do?
Once the interior was photographed, any stains were marked and rephotographed with a numbered marker, and then they were tested with phenolphthalein to see if there was the indication of the presence of blood. If there was, the item was swabbed, the stain was swabbed and collected.
Now, if I can back you up a bit, when you're back to the exterior of the vehicle.
Again, you are watching a live feed in the Wisconsin courtroom for the case of George Burch, who's on trial for the murder of Nicole Vanderheiden, and that is the crime lab analyst right there talking about evidence found in the car. And that car plays a crucial point in this case. You're not going to want to miss anything. We're going to go to a quick break, but we're going to go right back into the courtroom because we don't want you to miss anything. Stay tuned. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Law&Crime Live, everybody. We are looking at a live feed in the George Burch case. This is the feed into the Wisconsin courtroom. A crime lab analyst right now is on the stand talking about the DNA and other materials found inside Greg Matthews' car. Now, Greg Matthew is one of the best friends, I should say the best friend, of the victim's boyfriend in this case. And why that matters is because this victim's boyfriend, Douglas Dietrich, is the one the defense is saying committed the murder of Nicole Vanderheiden in this case. The prosecution is saying it's George Burch, the defense is saying it's the boyfriend, and now they're looking into evidence of Greg Matthews' car, and we know that in the night in question, the night that Nicole went missing and was ultimately found dead, Doug and Greg were together in his car. Again, I'm here with attorney David Eisbrouch. David, we talked about this earlier in the show. The prosecution has painted this as a random act of violence, okay? That George Burch came out of nowhere and killed Nicole Vanderheiden. Perfectly plausible. We see this stuff happening every day. However, when you have somebody that is intimately involved with the victim, shares a child with them, lives with them together, there's a series of text message conversations that shows that they were fighting. They seem to have a troublesome relationship either that night. What makes more sense for a juror?
Well, I think a critical point, and I did not see the boyfriend's testimony yesterday, so perhaps, Jesse, you can help me out with this, is he was arrested initially. And if I was a defense attorney, I'm bringing that out in cross-examination, that he was held for 17 days. He was the primary suspect. They had a volatile relationship. Yes, they were still living together. Why did, he allow her to go out by herself that night? So there's a lot of he said, she said.
Let's talk a little bit about that. So we know that Nicole and her friends, or Nicole and a group of friends, went to another bar while Doug wasn't there yet. Doug was at another bar, and she was upset at him because she thought that he was talking to other women. He went home without her. He even admitted he didn't really look for her. We know that Nicole ran off on her own. He didn't contact the police until 17 hours later. He hadn't seen her for 17 hours. So under cross-examination, the defense says you hadn't seen her in 8 hours, and you kept doing this. You hadn't seen her in 17 hours. You went home, brushed your teeth, drank a glass of cold water, you went to sleep, woke up when the baby was crying, she still wasn't home, you put the baby back to sleep. You never were concerned about her? Now then again, people get into fights and they ignore each other. But is there something a little bit more sinister going on here?
If I wake up in the morning and my wife or girlfriend is not next to me, I'm making phone calls, I'm texting, I'm reaching out. It is another chip in the defense.
Well, David, you're a good guy. I mean, that's the difference. But look, I'm reserving judgment for everybody here. But the
that I'm a
point
good
is,
guy. You're reserving judgment.
not on you,
Oh,
but
okay.
on Douglas Dietrich.
All right.
I don't know
Okay.
what their relationship was, but you're a good guy, a normal guy. Who knows what kind of relationship they had?
Was this normal in their relationship? Was it normal for her to go out with her girlfriends and not report back in the morning or sleep over a girlfriend's home? Did the boyfriend testify to that? Is the defendant, who's claiming that, he was in the car and the boyfriend beat him up at some point, does he have an explanation? And he's probably not going to take the stand, but did he call the police? Did he go to the hospital? Did he seek medical attention if he was beat up? Did he report it to the police to get him arrested?
We know that when the police investigated Doug, he was wearing the same clothes as he was wearing the night before, and he had no injuries. So if you want to say, as the defense says, that he knocked George Burch out and killed Nicole, I would imagine, and we know that there was evidence of a struggle on her, wouldn't there be something on him?
Absolutely. You're looking for a struggle. You're looking for the forensics. You're looking, and also to your theory of why he didn't call anyone for 17 hours, then the defense is going to, go in the direction and try to intimate that, was he cleaning himself up? Was he taking a shower? Was he, trying to hide any bruises he had? But forensics, and they didn't look at him, I don't think right away. It was 17 hours later, but they did arrest him. Yep. So he was incarcerated immediately, so they would have taken those tests, they would have done the forensics, and if there was an altercation, they would have seen it on his body.
Let's look back in the courtroom. We do have a live feed. Again, the crime lab analyst is on the stand. She's going through some documents right there, some of the evidence in this case. Again, looking at Greg Matthews Carr, the friend of the boyfriend in this case. Let's listen in if we can just for a little bit.
Slinger asked you to measure the position of the driver's seat?
He did.
And did you find in your examination of the vehicle that there was 2 programmed positions of the driver's seat?
There was a memory 1 and a memory 2 position.
And what position was the vehicle in when you examined it?
I don't know.
Do you remember measuring what it was in?
I do. I have the approximate measurements in my notes.
Can you tell us what those were? I believe it's on page 12 at the bottom.
The current position of the driver's seat as it was approximately 29 degrees leaning back, 14 5/8 of inches from the parking brake to the side plastic on the driver's seat, and approximately 15.5 inches from the floor to the high point on the side of the driver's seat.
And that was the current position when you examined the vehicle?
Correct.
And you didn't move that beforehand?
No.
And then what about the other memory position? What is the length from the driver's seat to the parking brake?
I then did 2 additional measurements, one pushing the position 2 button and one pushing the position 1 button. The position 2 button was 20 degrees leaning back, approximately 11.25 inches from the parking brake to the side.
You're watching a live feed in the George Burch courtroom, and that crime lab analyst who's on the stand right now just testified to finding a stain on the driver's side third row seat in Greg Matthews' vehicle. It tested positive for blood. Greg Matthew is the best friend of the boyfriend of the victim in this case. Everyone's connected, and something's not looking right. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back and go straight to the courtroom. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. Okay, well, let's go back to Wisconsin. We're in the George Burch case. We have a live feed in the courtroom. Right now, Katie Hoffmeyer, who's a forensic scientist, is on the stand. Right now, she's just giving her background, certain details before she goes into the meat of this case. We'll talk about that in a second, but I want to talk about the last witness who took the stand, a crime lab analyst, who testified to the fact that they found a stain, a blood stain, on the driver's side third row seat in Greg Matthews' vehicle. Greg Matthew is the best friend of the victim's boyfriend. And why all of this matters is because the defense, who's representing George Burch, the defendant in this case, is saying that it was the boyfriend. It was Douglas Dietrich, the one that killed Nicole Vanderhyde and the victim in this case. Again, I'm here with attorney David Eisbrouch. How important is that now for the defense to jump on?
Very important. And I didn't see a cross-examination there. She was on that stand and off very quickly. But, you know, I want to know, as a defense attorney, how old is that stain? How long has it been there? And the fact that there's a blood stain in the friend's car would be indicative, possibly for the defense. They're going to want to argue that the boyfriend was there that night, was bleeding, and obviously as a result of an altercation he had with the defendant. So it becomes critically important. Again, as your last guest, Misty, I believe, talked about this morning, it all comes down to reasonable doubt. And this is just another piece fitting into that reasonable doubt argument. And besides all of this, it's really just one word against another, and they're trying to fit in all the DNA and the forensic evidence.
It's a battle of evidence, and that's what maybe this forensic scientist is going to talk about. Let's listen in live to that Wisconsin courtroom, and we'll be back here to talk about some more of this case. Let's listen in. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. And speaking of live, we have a live feed in Wisconsin in the George Burch case. This is the courtroom right there. It's a live feed. A new witness is on the stand, a law enforcement officer. And basically what you hear is this is just laying the foundation of who this witness is. We'll jump right back into the courtroom, but I want to talk to our guest right now, attorney David Eisbrouch. We're talking about evidence this morning, and one of the key pieces of evidence in this case, and why it's gained national media attention, why we're covering it here on the network, is because of the Fitbit data. Now, we know that some of the Fitbit data will be allowed in, namely the step counting data, but not the sleep counting data. And we're talking about Douglas Dietrich, the boyfriend, him wearing a Fitbit. How do you think the Fitbit evidence is going to play in?
Well, it's my understanding, reading some of the background on the trial, that the Fitbit can indicate if he was sleeping. Even though they're not allowing the sleeping indicator to come in, the Fitbit itself can indicate if he was sleeping at that time or if he was moving at that time. That's what I believe the relevance will be here. And if it shows that he was sleeping or not active at the time, it would, obviously pierce the defendant's story.
Do you have any concern about using this new technology in the courtroom?
New technology is used in courtrooms every day in criminal trials, in civil trials, from easy passes to Fitbit type apparatuses to heart monitors to sometimes implants in somebody's body used for identification. So technology is evolving every day with civil and criminal trials.
And the concern that it might not be reliable?
That's going to be up to the defense to pierce on cross.
It's a good answer. It's a good answer, lawyerly answer right there. All right, let's listen into the courtroom and we can hear what this witness is saying, and then we'll come back to analyze it.
The area with other officers and other investigators that were out there to try and find any items that we may have deemed of evidentiary value at that time.
Where did that grid search occur?
We started it pretty much right where the body was located, and then moved to the east and then also to the west towards where the entry road was that we've all seen on the pictures, and then we kind of moved to the south where that large mound was into the field.
Were you the only investigator participating in that search?
No, there was, I can't tell you how many, but there was a large number of us that were kind of doing a grid search where, it was kind of explained earlier, you walk side to side in arm's length of each other to try and check the area to see if anything would catch your eye.
What sort of items are you looking for at that point?
Well, at that time I had information that it was a blunt force trauma. Sergeant Lopnow and I had been in communications. He was down with the crime lab and he had witnessed the body. So we were looking for any sort of items that may have caused that damage. Like stated earlier, there's a lot of rocks and a lot of things like that in the field that could potentially have been used. So we were looking through those rocks to see if there may have been any blood or any other sorts of evidence on any of those rocks.
And did you find anything of evidentiary value during that search?
We did not.
And again, this was on May 22nd, correct?
Correct, on Sunday.
Do you recall approximately what time?
Sometime later in the morning, closer to noon, possibly. I don't recall the exact time. I know I went over there once the race was over with, so it probably had to be 10, 11, somewhere in that time frame.
And do you recall approximately for how long?
We were a good couple hours. It's obviously, you've seen the pictures. It's a rather large field and a rather large area to try and go through. It's pretty bare, so it wasn't difficult terrain or anything, but we wanted to make sure we did a thorough job.
So apart from the grid search, were you asked to perform any other duties at that time?
So yeah, once the grid search was done, I was advised of this missing person report that was filed the day prior, and that a statement had been taken from Mr. Dietrich advising of the acts that happened on Friday night. So I went and reached out to a bunch of the witnesses that he had advised law enforcement that he was out with to try and get statements from them.
Did you speak with those individuals?
I spoke with quite a few of them. I don't remember offhand which exact witnesses that I spoke to. There was a handful of them that I went out and obtained written statements from to get their accounts of the night prior.
And at a certain point in the investigation, did you assume, I guess we'll call it lead investigator status?
Correct. Initially on Sunday, I was advised that Sergeant Lopnow was going to be the lead case agent on this and that I would be assisting him. However, due to the lengthy autopsy process and the fact that he was down in Madison for 2 days, he had kind of lost some knowledge of the case, so to speak, as far as what was happening back here in Green Bay, what was happening with interviews, searches, things of that nature. So it was discussed. I don't remember the exact date and time, but probably somewhere on Monday on the 23rd, I was approached by Lieutenant Valley and Captain Conrath and asked if I would take the lead role in this investigation and work with Sergeant Lopnow.
And what does that role specifically entail?
So my role in this was obviously to go back, review all the reports, all the statements, all the information that we currently had so that I could get myself up to speed as to where everything was. I was not at the scene at Doug Dietrich and Nicole Van Heiden's residence. I was not there, so I needed to freshen myself up on what that scene entailed at the house when that search warrant had been done that night prior. And then I also directed assisting personnel to write different search warrants, went out and tried to make arrangements to get different surveillance video recovered, and then basically analyzed any information that would come back to me from those assignments that I asked other officers to assist me with.
That initial review of all the evidence in the case, did that process continue throughout this entire investigation?
Correct. As information and evidence evolved to us, that's what led us in the direction of the investigation.
So it's fair to say, as the lead investigator in this case, you're aware of every facet of the investigation?
Yes.
With respect to the initial investigation, was there a search conducted at Mr. Dietrich's residence on Berkeley Road?
Yes, I was aware of 2 search warrants that were done at the residence. One would have been late Saturday night, early Sunday morning, and then the second on the 23rd.
Sunday morning, what date would that be?
That would be the 22nd.
In the early morning hours, you said?
Yeah, like I said, I don't remember if they did it late on the 21st or early on the 22nd. I don't have that exact time.
And when was the second search done?
The second one was done on the night of the 23rd, which would have been Monday.
You're watching a live feed into the George Burch courtroom out of Wisconsin. Again, that is a Detective Brian Slinger, the lead investigator in this case, talking about examining the field where Nicole Vanderheiden's body was found. Very interesting to hear the lead detective in this case talking about the investigation. We have to go to a short break, but don't worry, we're going to go right back into the courtroom. We don't want you to miss anything, so stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Law&Crime Live, everybody. We are covering the George Burch case live. We have a feed in the Wisconsin courtroom. And right now, Detective Brian Slinger, a lead detective in this case, the case of Nicole Vanderheiden, the woman that was killed back in May 2016. We're learning a lot of information from this witness as well as some other witnesses prior. I want to talk about what we're hearing from this man right here. Again, I'm here with attorney David Eisbrouch. David, what he just testified to was that he spent so much time talking about this pair of Air Jordans that were taken from Douglas Dietrich's garage. Again, Douglas Dietrich is the boyfriend of the victim in this case, the same person that the defense is saying is the murderer. Slinger says that there was a herringbone zigzag type pattern on Vanderheiden's back, indicating that they may come from an Air Jordan. Why would Douglas Dietrich's pattern of his shoe be on the back of Nicole Vanderheiden unless he had something to do with her murder?
Definitely corroborates the defendant's story that there was an altercation said in prior testimony, prior statements, but he may not testify here. So it's going to be interesting how the jury gets this information.
Well, I think that the prosecution and the now could change. That the defense will not put on their case about what happened really between Nicole, George, and Doug until George takes the stand. So our belief right now is that he will take the stand. If he does take the stand, how much danger is that for the defense?
Never a good, I mean, the school of law, so to speak, is never a good idea for the defendant to take the stand because you don't know what they're going to say. They could open doors to other past instances that the defense attorney doesn't want to come in. This particular defendant was acquitted 20 years prior. You know, if he opens the door to any credibility issues or anything that relates to that, the cross-examination is going to try to get that in, you know, obviously as soon as possible. But the judge is going to be very particular about that. Going back to his testimony, though, he's going to testify, if he does, that there was an altercation, that he was kicked by the boyfriend, and that's how the footprint got on his back.
It's an interesting story, and we know right now we believe the prosecution may rest their case Monday or Tuesday of next week. Again, we are going to cover it here on Law and Crime Live and on the Crime Investigation Network. I want to go back right now into the courtroom to hear more of this testimony because it's becoming very interesting about what happened in the night in question.
Mr. Dietrich and Ms. Vanderheiden's residence on Berkeley Road?
On the inside?
To the actual residence.
I've been to the residence, and up until recently, I was never inside.
And are you aware of whether or not that location is within Brown County, Wisconsin?
Correct, in the village or town of Ledgeview.
Brown County, Wisconsin?
Correct.
During the investigation, was it ultimately determined that investigators would take Mr. Dietrich into custody?
Correct. I had on Monday, the 23rd, when we responded out to that scene in front of the residence, I had discussed briefly with Lieutenant Valley and Captain Conrath as to the direction of the investigation. We decided that based on the initial evidence that we had and the initial information that we had, that we would arrest Doug Dietrich.
And you were involved in that decision?
I was.
Can you let us know what factors played into that decision?
Sure. Well, up until that night, or I'm sorry, up until Monday night, the 23rd, we really weren't sure where Nicole was killed. Obviously, we knew where the body was located. Monday night, we had this crime scene, close proximity to their residence. At the time, we had known about this herringbone pattern that was on her back. I knew that these shoes were found in the garage, which had about 5 or 6 red stains at the bottom that appeared to be possibly could have been blood. We also had some blood in the garage that was located near where Miss Vanderheiden's vehicle was, that was presumptively tested for blood. And then looking at the photographs of Miss Vanderheiden's vehicle, it appeared that there was a lot of smudges, there was a lot of stains. that may have been consistent with blood. So at that time, we had thought that that vehicle was potentially used to transport her body.
And there was also suspected blood located within the residence?
Yeah, there was a few little areas that I was advised of that up in a bathtub, and then also at the lower bathroom, there was some tissues with blood and then a sweatshirt with blood that was located in that lower bathroom.
And where was Mr. Dietrich ultimately arrested?
Sergeant Steffens and I, or Sergeant Holzbach, I'm sorry, she had had a good rapport with Mr. Dietrich, so she made a phone call to him asking him to meet with us again. He agreed, advised us he was at his parents' residence, which is a short distance away from his house. Myself, Sergeant Holzbach, and Lieutenant White then drove over to Mr. Dietrich's parents' residence to make contact with him.
Did you personally take Mr. Dietrich into custody?
I did. They knew we were coming, so Doug and his mother were waiting for us at the door, and greeted us at the door. I asked Doug to step out of the residence and explained to him that he was being arrested, and placed him into handcuffs and transported him to the Brown County Jail.
And prior to that, Mr. Dietrich voluntarily advised you of his location?
Correct.
When you placed Mr. Dietrich into custody, were you able to observe his demeanor?
Yeah, I would describe it as, and I'm not great with words all the time, but I would describe it as like someone just, killed your dog. It was just like a blank, like, I can't believe this is happening stare that he had, like probably a moment of shock. And then it was a short time later, once we placed Mr. Dietrich into our vehicle, that he broke down and started crying and was real emotional.
If you can generally discuss the arrest procedure, when you make an arrest, are you charging an individual?
No, so as law enforcement, I know there's the misconception out there, and even as some of the, when you're going through school, you don't have a great understanding of it until you actually do the job. So law enforcement will make an arrest based on facts that they have, based on statements they have, based on evidence they have, place somebody in jail, and then we do what's called attorney's office in this case, where they'll review our reports, they'll review the information that we provide to them, and then ultimately the charging is up to the Brown County District Attorney's Office if they're going to actually charge somebody or not.
When you make an arrest, is that the end of your investigation?
No, the arrest is, probably the majority of the work is post-arrest, I would say, because we want to make sure that the person we have in custody is the right person, and if it's not, we want to exonerate that person.
And are you aware of how long Mr. Dietrich was in custody for?
It was 18, 19 days.
During that time period, is the investigation continuing?
Oh, absolutely. During that time, I was continuing to review surveillance, continuing to go through the evidence that was collected, in particular swabs that were taken, sending those into the crime lab. I was put into communication with analyst Kevin Scott down in Madison, who was assigned to this case. He was keeping in constant communication with me as far as his findings on things that I was sending into him. And based upon what he was telling me was gearing my direction on next items that I would send into the lab.
Let's discuss the items that were sent to the lab. As the lead investigator, were you primarily responsible for deciding what items got sent to the lab?
For the most part, I believe there was upwards of 13, 14 evidence transmittals that we did. Evidence transmittals are forms that I would fill out, provide to our evidence technician. That way they can take those items out of evidence and package them up and have them sent to the crime lab. And an evidence transmittal can be as small as one item, or it could be up to 15, 20 items. So to say I did every one, I did not, but the majority of them I did.
But you are aware of what was sent ultimately?
Correct. Ultimately, the decision to send certain items was up to me. Whether I filled the form out or not may not have been the case.
And are you able to approximate the number of items that were put into evidence in this case?
Put into evidence, I would have to guess probably 350 to 400 items of evidentiary value were taken throughout the investigation.
And are you able to send all of those items at one time to the crime lab?
I wish, and we tried sending a lot more than we were allowed to send because obviously we wanted answers quick. There are policies and procedures that they have that we 10 items at a time, and then once they're done processing those items, they advise us, and then we can send some more. Unfortunately, it's not like you see on TV and you can put an item in a machine and it gives you an answer in an hour. It takes them time that I'm sure they can speak of later.
In determining what items got sent to the lab, did you select the first 10 items that were collected?
Not necessarily collected. The first 10 items that were collected, no, it didn't have anything to do with the order in which they were collected.
And how did you determine which items in which order were sent to the lab?
Well, we looked at all the items that we had. The clothing that was discovered on the highway was in front of the house were very important to us. First, to determine whether, in fact, that blood was, in fact, Nikki's blood. And as well as some of the other items from the garage. The items we were focusing on at the beginning was in relation to Doug, because we wanted to make sure, again, that this was something he was responsible for, and those items would be able to lead us to that or not.
That's Detective Brian Slinger, the lead investigator in the Nicole Vander Heiden murder. Again, I'm here with attorney David Eisbrouch. This is important, I would imagine, for the state to show. Let's show how they examined this case and why they ruled Dietrich out.
You know, what comes to mind is, O.J. Simpson trial. They went through it very meticulously, what the cops did, what they didn't do. So this is going to be very important for the defense to poke holes in the procedures that the police used collecting evidence, how they collected evidence, what evidence they submitted to the labs, and what evidence they didn't submit to the lab. So this is, again, just a foundation, a building block of what's to come for the defense.
And he's the one who actually arrested Dietrich. Now, again, Douglas Dietrich is the boyfriend of Nicole Vander Heiden, the victim in this case, and it's the same person that George Burch, the defendant, is saying committed this murder. So you have to think, this guy is the lead investigator. He seems pretty sharp from what I can tell on the stand. Seems like he did a thorough investigation. 350 to 400 items of evidence were sent in for analysis. He inspected all of the surveillance tapes, everything. I don't see anything slipping through the cracks.
Well, if I was a defense incarcerated in custody for 17 days if he wasn't the ultimate defendant.
Is that not standard?
Not
17 days?
Keep somebody in jail for 17 days while you're doing forensic investigations, while you're testing with the labs, then all of a sudden you make a decision 17 days later, oops, got the wrong guy.
Yeah.
And this also goes back to the blood evidence that the prior witness was testifying to in the victim's car.
Let's talk about that. So we saw a crime lab analyst come on the stand earlier. She testified that there was no blood found in Nicole's car. That defeats the defense's theory there, doesn't it? That the murder happened, that the murder, it seems from everything they said, if George Burch was sleeping with Nicole in her car outside of her house, or even if there was somehow connected, what does that tell you that the fact there was no blood found in her car?
Well, I don't think it defeats the defense. It may defeat some of the prosecution's case, because the defense case is that's exactly what the defendant said. They had consensual sex in the car. He left her alone. There was no altercation in there. There was no blood found in the car. So that really helps the defense.
Yeah.
If that's where you were going.
Well, I think it's interesting because we're not 100% sure what happened yet. I mean, we still hear two theories about who committed the murder, whether or not they actually had sex, were they outside the home. We know her blood was found outside the home and on a cord, and his DNA, George Burch's DNA, was found on her. This is what we know, but we're trying to piece together the rest of the story.
The more inconsistencies, better to defense, better to get to reasonable doubt. All they have to do is get to reasonable doubt. They have to get to this jury, and after they start deliberations, they have to decide beyond a reasonable doubt that this defendant killed her. And if there are these many, many inconsistencies during the trial on blood evidence, on physical evidence, on forensic evidence, it's going to be very difficult for a jury to convict.
I agree with you there. Again, you're watching Brian Slinger. We're about to go back into the courtroom. He said that they arrested Douglas Dietrich because the murder happened outside the home, and there was some blood evidence, it turned out not to be Nicole's, that was found inside the garage and the house. Obviously, if there's blood there, they're going to be suspicious. So let's listen. Actually, I think they're going to a sidebar right there. They're in a sidebar. So let's stick around here, David, and talk more about the issues in this case. We talked about George Burch taking the stand, okay? We expect it to happen next week when the prosecution rests their case either on Monday or Tuesday. It could be an elaborate story. So then what is the defense strategy moving forward? They have to prove their entire case because it's different, right? Everybody has, a defense attorney just has to prove reasonable doubt. Now they're trying to prove a different case, or is it different?
That defense doesn't have a standard here. They don't have to prove anything. The prosecution has to prove. That's why I'll believe the defendant takes the stand when he actually takes the stand.
But let's say he had sex. He's like, I had sex with her. I met her in a bar. Don't they need to show something to prove this actually happened?
Well, and you and I were discussing this off camera before. What bar did they meet? Is there any surveillance, video surveillance of them in the bar? He's going to admit that he met her. He's going to admit that they left the bar together. It may not be the bar that the boyfriend was at earlier. It could have been a different bar. His story is we went to a car, we had sex. If the forensics match up to his story, it's going to help him get to where he needs to go in this case.
And we have to know if there were injuries to George Burch, too, because according to his theory, or according to the theory put over by the defense, is he was attacked by Douglas Dietrich, and when he woke up, he was knocked unconscious. Everything happened.
Yes, more physical evidence, and if he doesn't have any bruises on his body, it goes to his credibility. But again, I see so much conflicting evidence, so much conflicting testimony in this case that I don't think reaching reasonable doubt is a very far hurdle.
Well, we'll have to see. Let's listen back in on this lead investigator in this case.
I felt like that device would be able to give us information from the car, whether it was actually driven or not during that time frame.
In addition to that evidence, what other investigative measures did you look at?
Well, I was also in contact with, besides Kevin Scott, with the two individuals that you had just had up here on the stand, speaking to them as far as what they found in their analysis of the Buick Rendezvous, as well as the other Buick, which was which was Greg Matthews' vehicle.
At any point, apart from Nikki and Greg's vehicles, did investigators look at Doug's vehicle?
We did seize Doug's vehicle from the watering hole. We did not send that one into the crime lab to be searched. The process you heard, like these last two vehicles, simply because we knew that vehicle was at the watering hole all night, so that the time was accounted for that vehicle.
And in fact, Mr. Dietrich's vehicle was ultimately towed from the watering hole?
Correct. His vehicle was towed from the watering hole and then brought to the Brown County Sheriff's Office, where we subsequently did do a search of it, just not to the extent that you heard with the other two vehicles.
Was anything of evidentiary value located in Mr. Dietrich's vehicle?
No.
In addition to searches of vehicles, were you also obtaining phone records during this time?
Correct. Obtaining phone records, going through phone records, as you can imagine, there's a lot of data to go through: text messages, phone calls, times, things like that, trying to verify statements that people had given us to make sure that the statements they give us were accurate.
And did you continue to obtain witness statements during this period as well?
Yeah, I mean, we had a good portion of our witness statements at that time. In going through some of the video, especially from the sardine can, we were in the process of trying to determine who was all at that bar, to try and identify them, and in particular anyone that Nikki may have talked to. And the other thing we did during that time was we really needed to figure out how Nikki got home. We had our time frame at that point that she was last seen walking at 12:30, 12:36. And then we knew from Mr. Peterson's calling in through the jogger's statement that our crime scene would have likely happened sometime around 5:30, 5:45. So we had that window. So our main priority at that point was to figure out how Nikki got home. We asked for the assistance of the public through the media, through Facebook, and anyone that may have seen her that night, anyone that may have given her a ride home. We checked with all the local cab companies. We were going to check with Uber, however, through looking at her phone, she did not have an Uber app on there. It's my understanding that that's the only way to get an Uber, so we didn't go down that route. But our main priority at that point was to figure out how Nikki got from the area of the sardine can to her residence and what happened during that time.
Are you also drafting search warrants for the phones of individuals?
Yes, for people, we did do consensual downloads on some phones, and then we also went back and did search warrants as well. There's two types of search warrants. You can do a physical search warrant for the phone where you're actually hooking it up to a machine where it actually extracts the data from it, and then you'd also write a search warrant to the phone company, AT&T, US Cellular, Verizon, or whatever, to get their physical phone records. So there would be two separate warrants written for whichever measure we were going with at that point.
You did ultimately obtain and review the phone records and information from Mr. Dietrich's phone.
Correct.
And why was that significant?
It was significant to compare to his statements that he had given us, to see if there was any inconsistencies in his story versus data that we would have had on his phone as far as locations, as far as conversations, as far as phone calls.
What did that information reveal?
All that information reviewed that
That's Detective Brian Slinger, the lead investigator in this case, talking about how he investigated the case and what he conducted searches of, social media accounts, everything into Nicole's life and Douglas's life as well. This has been a thorough investigation, as you can hear, and now George Burch is on trial for the murder of Nicole. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll go right back into the courtroom. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. We're covering the George Burch case out of Wisconsin. They're in a short break right now, so if they do get a live feed back, we'll make sure to go back into the courtroom. We are talking right now about Detective Brian Slinger, who was the investigative sergeant, the lead investigator in this case. And Brian Slinger was testifying about the fact that they did a thorough investigation, and how they ruled out Douglas Dietrich. Now, again, I'm here with attorney David Eisbrouch. You heard this. We've all heard this. They did a thorough investigation. No blood, nothing really. They looked at the phone records. They tried to check local cab companies. Thorough investigation, and they singled out Douglas Dietrich at first, and then they released him. This isn't looking good for the defense. What do they have to do when they cross-examine this guy?
Well, when you say not looking good for the defense, in a way, it's very helpful to the defense because it's showing that the police in this case botched up whatever they were trying to do.
How?
And they arrested the wrong guy.
But how would they do that?
Well, they went on the evidence that they first saw. They first thought there was blood at the house, I believe. That was later ruled out. There was no blood in the car afterwards. So at some point, there was no nexus. There was no connection to the boyfriend and the murder. They didn't have enough to hold him at that point. But what then made them look at the actual defendant? To me, very beneficial for the defense counsel. They're going to look at this, again, not to repeat myself, but they're going to point fingers at the police, at the investigation. You got the wrong guy. You had all the evidence. What you test was wrong? Was it incomplete? Was it inconclusive? Obviously, it was inconclusive because they released the guy. And now you've got another guy who you don't have any blood evidence against either.
We see juries convicting people when there's no body, all right, when you just have circumstantial evidence. So let's take the flip side here, okay? The defense is putting on a story that George Burch had a relationship with Nicole Vanderheiden, and that Douglas Dietrich killed Nicole when he saw them cheating, okay? Could be true, could not be true. The idea of how important it was for Douglas Dietrich to be on the stand and how he testified, and also the fact that he really didn't do much when Nicole was missing. Didn't really call the police until much later, went to sleep pretty easily, took care of the baby. Would that be enough to convince, and if the defense didn't even have to put on one shred of evidence, just they have George Burch testify, and maybe that's it. Maybe that's all they do. They just have him testify, and that's it. No other witnesses. Is that enough to maybe convince one juror? Have you seen something like that in the past?
One, you don't usually see, no, I haven't. I have never seen a defendant be the only witness called, and that would depend solely on his testimony, how credible it was. If the defense has somebody reading the jury right now, if they have a jury consultant in there, how do they feel, after he testifies? You made a great point, Jesse. You can convict on circumstantial evidence. There is a ton of circumstantial evidence in this case, but it's a lot of controversial circumstantial evidence, and they are going to have to tighten up the evidence against this defendant. The prosecution's hopes for a conviction here.
We have to try to understand a little bit what happened that night, and when we piece together this story, just like the jury is, they're listening to each one of the witnesses to try to understand. What I want to play for you right now is Aaron Kalinsky, who was a friend of Douglas Dietrich, again, the boyfriend of Nicole van der Heijden. And I want you to hear Aaron's testimony, and I want you to listen carefully, because what he is going to testify to is when Nicole became combative at night, and right after they left the second bar, she ran out of the bar. She was very upset at Doug, and it gives you a glimpse into what was happening that night, particularly between Nicole and her boyfriend. Let's listen in.
What was she screaming?
Get away, something to that effect, and just screaming in general.
What was your reaction to that?
I knew there was people across the street at a bonfire, and I just looked over there and I just saw all faces looking at me, so I just backed off and helped her up, and she kept on going up Howard.
She kept going west on Howard?
Yeah, until she got to Maple Street.
What did she do then, if you could see?
She crossed Howard and went onto the sidewalk on Maple Street and continued down Maple Street
Which direction?
south.
Could you see if she was doing anything at this point in time while she was walking?
She was on her phone.
Could you hear her?
No, I couldn't hear her.
While she kept walking, did you yell anything at her?
Yes, I did.
What did you yell?
I just yelled, we could get you home faster to your child and what you're doing. And I yelled, you're a babe in the woods.
Did she turn around and respond to that?
No, she didn't.
Did she answer you in any way?
Nope.
What did you do then?
I could hear the girls yelling that our ride is here. So I'm looking at Nikki and hearing the girls, and I retreat back.
The last time you saw her then, where was she?
She was walking down Maple.
And you could see that it appeared her phone was working at that point because she was using it?
Yes.
Did you have an Uber pick you up?
Crystal came, scheduled an Uber, yeah. We had,
Where did that arrive? What street did it pull up on?
that was Howard, right on it would be on Howard Street, but on the corner of Broadway and Howard.
Was Nikki still in view when you got in the Uber?
No.
Was everybody able to fit in the Uber, or who all went?
Yes, we all, Courtney Grilkowski and Jesse Barakashan weren't with us. It was Darcy, Angela, Crystal, and I.
Now, while you were at the sardine can, was there a point in time that Doug called you?
Not that I recall.
Was there a point in time that it appeared he used Greg's phone to Darcy's phone to get in touch with you?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry then, I didn't state that very well. You
Yeah,
actually
my
talked.
phone had died, so yeah, he couldn't get a hold of me.
I'm sorry, whose phone died?
My phone died, so that would have been the reason he went through Darcy's phone.
Okay. And did you ask him anything while you were on the phone with him?
Yeah, I asked him where he was. And
And did he indicate what his plans were?
he said they were on their way.
Was that pretty much the extent of the conversation?
Yes.
Did you contact Doug later and let him know what you knew of where Nikki was?
I don't recall contacting Doug.
When's the next time you talked to Doug?
It would have been in the afternoon on Saturday. I don't believe it was voice to voice. I think it was text.
Okay. When you texted him, did you indicate to him what had taken place the early morning hours before?
Yes, I did.
What was his reaction at that point in time?
I could tell he was really concerned and that she wasn't home yet and something wasn't right.
And did you go into detail of how she walked off and the scene that took place on Howard?
Not into detail, but
But that she had walked off from you?
Yep, I pretty much paraphrased it for him.
At some point, did he indicate that he was going to file a missing person report?
Not at that time, I don't think he said
It's
that.
Aaron Kalinsky talking about the last time he saw Nicole Vanderheiden alive. Beautiful young mother that was taken way too soon in a case that we're covering here on the Law and Crime Network, Law and Crime Live here. And we have a live feed in the courtroom that we've been covering all day. And that's that beautiful mother right there. And as most of the witnesses have testified, she was a great mother, great mother. And now the determination is who did it? Who did it? George Burch is on trial. He is charged with the first-degree intentional homicide of this young mother. But his team is blaming the boyfriend, Douglas Dietrich. We see it a lot. Again, I'm here with attorney David Eisbrouch. David, it was great to have you on the program today. I want to talk a little bit more before we sign off.
Great to be here again.
Can you imagine what he's going through, Aaron Kalinsky? He was talking about a little bit when she got combative, Nikki, and she ran off, and he got in an Uber. You think he feels guilt?
It's hard to tell what this guy feels. I'm watching this guy, and he seems like he's on drugs. And he said he was heavily sedated the night afterwards, and he doesn't remember speaking to anyone. He actually, by his own admission, said he was sedated with sleeping pills. I'm not speculating if he's on any drugs now, but his demeanor is just, very, very low key. Doesn't remember details, very specifically. But I'm sure it's very difficult for him to recall what happened that night.
How nerve-wracking is it for people to be witnesses and try to testify to something 2 years ago?
It's interesting. When I try cases and I prep when I prep witnesses for testimony, some of the people you think are going to testify the best testify the worst, and vice versa. Some people you're really nervous about will testify very well. He's obviously doesn't have a lot at stake here. He's not a defendant. He's probably not a key witness. I would think he's nervous, but I think he's just up there saying what he recalls.
And what do you look forward to most in this case? Are you looking forward to that Fitbit data? You're a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. It sets some legal precedent, doesn't it?
Well, the thing you have to look forward to in this case, if the defendant's going to testify.
Oh, of course, that's juicy, and we're going to cover it here on Law and Crime Live. But the Fitbit data being used, I think that's what's garnering a lot of attention in the media right now.
Yeah, the Fitbit is very interesting, not only to show what your heart rate is and the steps you took that day, but also, as I said before, if you are sleeping at the time. If they can establish that he was sleeping and there were no steps being taken or his heart rate wasn't being monitored, then, it goes obviously against the defense theory here.
David, it was great to have you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Jesse, thanks for having me.
Of course. All right, everybody. So again, we covered the George Burch case here, this man who was charged with first-degree intentional homicide. What will happen to him? Will the defense put on a strong case to show that he's not the one who did it? We do expect the state to rest their case either Monday or Tuesday, and we're going to cover it here. That's about all the time we have here on the Crime and Investigation Network. You can go to lawandcrime.com. We're going to continue covering this George Burch case live on the network. You can go there, lawandcrime.com. We're going to continue it for the rest of the day. You don't want to miss anything. It's been a great day. We've covered a very, very important case. A lot at stake here for many different people. We're going to cover it next week. Thank you so much. Have a great day.